Schools are supposed to be places of learning, but sometimes they hide terrifying secrets.
Lisa never thought of herself as someone who believed in ghosts. She was the rational type, the kind of person who found explanations for everything. When her friends talked about the haunted library at their high school, she rolled her eyes and dismissed their tales as just another urban legend meant to scare freshmen. That was until the night it happened to her. Started like any other day. Lisa had gotten detention, not for skipping class or doing anything rebellious, but for forgetting to hand in her chemistry assignment. Her teacher, Mr. Carver, was notoriously strict about deadlines, and a single missed assignment was enough to land her in trouble. Detention in the library, he had said matter-of-factly, handing her the slip. You'll have 2 hours to complete your work. No phones, no excuses. Lisa groaned but didn't argue. It wasn't the first time she'd stayed late at school, and the library was usually quiet and peaceful. Perfect place to focus. When she arrived, the library was almost empty. The fluorescent lights hummed faintly above, and the smell of old books filled the air. Mrs. Whitaker, the elderly librarian, was sitting at her desk, flipping through a magazine. "Just you tonight, dear," she said with a kind smile as Lisa walked in. "Find a seat wherever you like." Lisa chose a table near the back, away from the main entrance. She liked the solitude, it helped her think. Setting her bag down, she pulled out her notebook and began working on the chemistry problems Mr. Carver had assigned. For the first hour, everything was normal. The only sounds were the scratch of her pen against paper and the occasional turn of a page from Mrs. Whitaker's desk. Outside, the sun dipped below the horizon, and the library grew darker, the overhead lights casting long shadows across the floor. That's when she heard it, a faint thump. Lisa paused, her pen hovering above the page. She glanced around, but the library was still. Mrs. Whitaker didn't seem to notice anything, so Lisa shrugged and went back to her work. Thump. This time it was louder. Lisa frowned. The sound was coming from one of the shelves behind her. She turned in her seat, peering into the rows of books, but all she saw were shadows stretching between the aisles. "Mrs. Whitaker?" she called softly. The librarian looked up from her magazine. "Yes, dear. Did you hear that noise?" Mrs. Whitaker tilted her head, listening for a moment. When nothing happened, she shook her head. "Probably just the old heating system. This building makes all kinds of strange noises at night." Lisa nodded, though she wasn't entirely convinced. Still, she tried to brush it off and return to her assignment. But as the minutes ticked by, the noises grew more frequent. A shuffle here, a creak there, and then the books started falling. It began with a single book from the top shelf, landing with a loud thud on the floor. Lisa jumped in her seat, her heart pounding. "Mrs. Whitaker?" she called again, her voice trembling. But this time there was no response. Lisa turned toward the librarian's desk and froze. Mrs. Whitaker was gone. Her desk chair was empty, the magazine she'd been reading still lying open. The library was completely silent now, the kind of silence that presses against your ears and makes your skin crawl. Lisa stood up slowly, her eyes scanning the room. "Mrs. Whitaker?" she called again, louder this time. Her voice echoed off the walls, but there was no reply. She took a hesitant step toward the front desk, her shoes squeaking against the polished floor. That's when she saw it. A shadow, tall and dark, at the far end of the library. At first, she thought it was just the outline of a coat rack or some other piece of furniture. But then it moved. Lisa gasped, stumbling back toward her table. The shadow didn't have a face, but she could feel it watching her. Its presence was suffocating, like a heavy weight pressing down on her chest. Her rational mind tried to make sense of it. Maybe it was a trick of the light or her eyes playing tricks on her. But deep down, she knew it was something else, something she couldn't explain. "Hello," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The shadow didn't respond, but it started to move, slowly, deliberately, toward her. Lisa's instincts kicked in. She grabbed her bag and bolted for the exit, her heart pounding so loudly she could barely hear her own footsteps. As she ran, the lights flickered, plunging the library into momentary darkness. When they came back on, the shadow was closer. She reached the door and yanked on the handle, but it wouldn't budge. "Locked." "No, no, no," she cried, frantically pulling at the door. The shadow was almost upon her now, its dark form stretching across the floor like a living entity. Lisa turned and pressed her back against the door, tears streaming down her face. "Please," she whispered, "leave me alone." And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the shadow vanished. The library lights stopped flickering, and the oppressive silence lifted. Lisa stood there, trembling, for what felt like an eternity before she finally worked up the courage to move. When she turned around, the door was unlocked. She didn't stop running until she was outside, the cool night air hitting her face like a splash of water. Her breaths came in short, panicked gasps as she looked back at the school building. The library windows were dark, and there was no sign of Mrs. Whitaker or the shadow. The next day, Lisa tried to tell her friends what had happened, but no one believed her. When she asked the principal about Mrs. Whitaker, he gave her a puzzled look. "There's no one named Mrs. Whitaker working here," he said. Lisa never set foot in the library again. But sometimes, late at night, she dreams of that shadow, of its hollow eyes and the way it seemed to watch her. And when she wakes up, she can still feel its presence, lingering just beyond the edge of the light. It was a Wednesday morning like any other at Ridgewood High. The bustling sounds of students in the hallways, lockers slamming shut, and teachers preparing for their lessons filled the school. The spring sunlight streamed through the windows, creating warm patterns on the floors, and for most of the students, the day seemed perfectly ordinary. For Claire Thompson, a junior, it was another tedious day of classes. She sat in her history classroom, idly doodling in her notebook while Mr. Keller droned on about the American Revolution. Claire was counting down the minutes until lunch when the intercom crackled to life. The voice that followed was familiar but unsettling. "This is a lockdown. Teachers, secure your classrooms immediately. This is not a drill." The entire class froze. "Everyone under your desks," Mr. Keller barked, his usual calm demeanor replaced by a rare urgency. He rushed to lock the door and turn off the lights. Claire's heart began to race as she scrambled to hide beneath her desk. Lockdowns weren't unusual, but they were always announced in advance as part of a drill. This one was different. There had been no warning, and the tension in Mr. Keller's voice suggested that this wasn't practice. The room fell silent except for the faint sound of footsteps in the hallway. Claire's breath hitched. Someone or something was moving outside. The sound grew louder, slow, and deliberate, like whoever it was wanted to be heard. "Is it the police?" whispered Josh, the boy hiding next to her. "I don't know," Claire replied, her voice trembling. Mr. Keller gestured for everyone to stay quiet. His finger pressed to his lips. Claire watched him, her pulse hammering in her ears. He was staring at the door, his expression a mix of fear and confusion. The footsteps stopped. Then came the doorknob, turned slowly, rattling against the lock. The entire class held their breath, their eyes glued to the door. Whoever was on the other side tried again, twisting the knob harder this time, but it held firm. Claire could feel her hands shaking as she clutched her knees, her mind racing through worst-case scenarios. The intercom crackled again, startling everyone. "This is a lockdown. Teachers, secure your classrooms immediately. This is not a drill." The exact same announcement. Claire's stomach twisted. Something about the voice sounded off. It was the principal's voice, but it lacked its usual warmth. It was monotone, robotic, like it had been recorded and played on a loop. The footsteps resumed, moving away from their door and further down the hallway. Minutes dragged by like hours. The only sounds were the occasional squeak of sneakers against the linoleum and the faint hum of the fluorescent lights. Then, suddenly, a loud crash echoed through the building, followed by what sounded like distant, muffled screams. Claire's eyes darted to Mr. Keller, who looked as pale as a sheet. He motioned for everyone to stay where they were. "I think it's a shooter," Josh whispered, his voice barely audible. "Shut up," hissed Mia, another classmate. Claire didn't respond. Her mind was stuck on the intercom announcement. It repeated every 5 minutes, word for word, in that same eerie, emotionless tone. "This doesn't feel right," she muttered to herself. After what felt like an eternity, the sounds in the hallway stopped altogether. The silence was deafening. Finally, the intercom crackled one last time. "The lockdown is over. Teachers, you may resume your classes." No one moved. Mr. Keller hesitated, his hand hovering over the light switch. "Stay here," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. He unlocked the door cautiously and peeked into the hallway. The students watched him, holding their breaths. When he stepped back inside, his face was grim. "The hallway's empty," he said. "Stay put while I check with the front office." Claire wanted to object, to beg him not to go, but the words caught in her throat. She watched as Mr. Keller slipped into the hallway, the door closing softly behind him. Minutes passed, then 10, then 15. Mr. Keller didn't come back. "Should we go look for him?" Josh asked nervously. "No," Mia said firmly. "We stay here until someone comes for us." But Claire wasn't so sure. Something was deeply wrong. She couldn't ignore the unease crawling up her spine, the way the intercom announcement sounded like a broken record, or the fact that no one had come to reassure them. Her curiosity got the better of her. "I'm going to look," she said, crawling out from under her desk. "Are you insane?" Mia hissed, grabbing her arm. But Claire shook her off. "I'll be quick. I just want to see if Mr. Keller's okay." Before anyone could stop her, she opened the door just wide enough to slip into the hallway. The corridor was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that makes your skin prickle. The lights overhead flickered intermittently, casting long, shifting shadows. "Mr. Keller?" Claire whispered. No answer. She crept down the hallway, her sneakers barely making a sound against the floor. The lockers loomed on either side of her, their shiny surfaces reflecting the flickering light. She turned the corner and froze. There, halfway down the hallway, was Mr. Keller's clipboard. It was lying on the floor, papers scattered around it. But there was no sign of Mr. Keller. Claire's breath quickened as she bent down to pick up the clipboard. That's when she saw it. A single red handprint smeared on the wall, as if someone had tried to steady themselves. Her heart pounded in her chest. She had to get back to the classroom. When she turned to head back, she saw it. A figure stood at the far end of the hallway, shrouded in shadow. It wasn't moving, but she could feel its gaze locked on her. "Mr. Keller?" she called, though she already knew it wasn't him. The figure tilted its head, almost curiously, and then took a step forward. Claire bolted. She ran as fast as her legs could carry her, her breaths coming in short, panicked gasps. The classroom door was in sight, and she threw herself inside, slamming it shut behind her. "What happened?" Josh asked, his face pale. "Something's out there," Claire panted. "I don't know what," but the intercom crackled again, cutting her off. "This is a lockdown. Teachers, secure your classrooms immediately. This is not a drill." The voice sent chills down her spine. The next morning, the school was abuzz with rumors. The lockdown had been labeled a system glitch, but no one could explain the strange noises, the missing teacher, or the fact that several students claimed to have seen shadowy figures wandering the halls. Mr. Keller was never found. To this day, Claire refuses to talk about what she saw in the hallway. But every so often, when she's alone, she hears the intercom crackle, and that same eerie voice repeating, "This is a lockdown. This is not a drill." Brianna had heard the stories for years. Ridgewood Middle School was infamous in her small town, not just for its creaky old building, but for the disturbing rumors that clung to it like cobwebs. Every kid who walked those halls had heard the tale of the janitor who had vanished decades ago. Some said he had been murdered in the school and his body hidden away, while others believed he had gone insane and never left. Whatever the truth, one thing was certain. The janitor's closet in the East Wing was strictly off-limits. Teachers warned students never to go near it, and even the school staff avoided it whenever possible. The door was always locked, and yet, according to legend, strange noises could be heard coming from inside late at night. For Brianna, it was just another ghost story, until the day she found herself locked inside the very same closet. It all started on a Friday afternoon. Brianna had stayed after school for drama rehearsal. The play was next week, and her role as the lead had kept her busy for weeks. By the time rehearsal ended, the sun was already setting, casting long shadows through the empty hallways. "I'll lock up after you," called Mrs. Porter, the drama teacher, as she left the auditorium. "Thanks," Brianna called back, stuffing her script into her bag. She lingered for a moment, enjoying the quiet. It was rare to have the school to herself, and there was something oddly peaceful about the empty halls. But as she made her way toward the main exit, she realized she'd forgotten her jacket in the East Wing classroom where she'd left it that morning. "Great," she muttered under her breath. The East Wing was the oldest part of the school, and its dimly lit halls gave her the creeps. Still, she had no choice. The temperature outside was dropping fast, and she wasn't about to walk home without her jacket. The East Wing was even quieter than the rest of the school. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, and Brianna's footsteps echoed on the tiled floor. She hurried toward her classroom, keeping her eyes fixed ahead and trying to ignore the uneasy feeling creeping up her spine. As she reached her classroom, she noticed something strange. The door to the janitor's closet was ajar. That was odd. Brianna couldn't remember ever seeing it open before. She hesitated, her curiosity piqued despite the chill running down her spine. Peeking inside, she saw rows of cleaning supplies, mops, and buckets. And then she saw it. A small, dusty notebook lying on the floor, half hidden beneath a mop. Brianna glanced around. The hallway was empty, and the silence was deafening. Against her better judgment, she stepped inside and picked up the notebook. The cover was cracked and faded, and the pages inside were yellowed with age. Flipping through it, Brianna saw messy handwriting, as if the entries had been scribbled in a hurry. Most of it was illegible, but a few words stood out. Voices? Can't escape. Trapped. Her heart began to race as she turned to the last page. Help me. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind her. Brianna screamed and dropped the notebook, her hands scrambling for the doorknob. It wouldn't budge. "Hello," she yelled, pounding on the door. "Is anyone out there? Help me." The hallway remained silent. Her breathing quickened as she fumbled for her phone. She pulled it out of her pocket and turned on the flashlight, casting a weak beam of light around the tiny, cramped space. The shelves were lined with cleaning supplies, and the air smelled of mildew and bleach. That's when she heard it. Faint whisper. It was so soft she almost thought she'd imagined it. Brianna. Her blood ran cold. The voice was coming from behind her. Slowly, she turned the flashlight toward the back of the closet. At first, all she saw were shadows. But then, in the corner, something moved. It was a figure, thin and hunched, its face obscured by the darkness. "Who's there?" Brianna demanded, her voice shaking. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it moved closer, the sound of its shuffling steps filling the tiny space. Brianna pressed herself against the door, her flashlight trembling in her hand. "Let me out!" she screamed, banging on the door again. But no one came. The figure was only a few feet away now. In the dim light, Brianna could make out its features. A gaunt face with hollow eyes, its skin stretched tight over its bones. It opened its mouth as if to speak, but no sound came out. Desperate, Brianna grabbed a mop from the shelf and swung it at the figure, but it passed straight through, as if the figure were made of smoke. "Please," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Just let me go." The figure stopped moving. For a moment, it simply stared at her with those empty eyes. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, it said, "You're not supposed to be here." Before Brianna could respond, the light on her phone flickered and went out, plunging the closet into complete darkness. When she woke up, she was lying on the floor of the East Wing hallway. The janitor's closet door was closed, and the hallway was quiet except for the faint hum of the lights. Brianna sat up, her head spinning. Her phone was still in her hand, but the battery was dead. The notebook was nowhere to be seen. She staggered to her feet and ran out of the building, not stopping until she was outside in the cool night air. The next day, Brianna told her friends what had happened, but they didn't believe her. When she went back to the East Wing to check the janitor's closet, she found it locked as usual. But she knew what she had seen, and late at night, when she closed her eyes, she could still hear the voice whispering her name, warning her to stay away. Next time, it said, "You won't get out.